Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of our AGU Webinars Professional Development Series featuring Gabriel Fillippelli, Editor-in-Chief of GeoHealth. I'm Nathaniel Janik, Career Services Coordinator at AGU, and I'll be your host for today's webinar titled How to Write Effective Reviews and Improve Your Own Manuscript. A few things to go over before we begin. If you have questions during the presentation today, please type them into the question box in the right side control panel, and we will answer as many as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. And finally, the link to the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all attendees in a follow-up email in a few days. Once again, presenting today's webinar is Gabriel Fillippelli. Gabe is a biogeochemist who focuses on processes at the interface between the environment and humans. He is a professor of earth sciences and directs the Center for Urban Health at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Before I pass it along to him, though, we're going to start off with a brief poll. And the question to everyone is, have you, hold on one second. Have you ever had a manuscript submission rejected? So the choices are, yes, I have had a manuscript submission rejected, no, my submissions have always been accepted, or I have never submitted a manuscript before. So take a few more seconds to answer those. And I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And we have our results here. It looks like 58% have had a manuscript submission rejected. A small percentage have never submitted a manuscript before, but 36% of our crowd is lucky enough to have always had their submissions accepted. But it does sound like there's quite a few folks in here who have experienced the thrill of not having their manuscript accepted, so you're all in good company. Yeah, so Gabe, I'm going to pass this along to you now.
Well, fantastic, thank you. And I also am on the list of people who've had their manuscripts rejected in the past. So hopefully I will show you how to look at reviews, the review process in a way that you help those authors as much as possible in crafting outstanding contributions to science. As we probably are well aware, peer review and scientific publications are really the shared responsibility of all of us. So the quality of what is published is the mutual responsibility of both the authors of the studies and the reviewers themselves. And this quality control issue is becoming so important as often the scientific studies are used as a basis for policy, and you want sound science to make sound policy. And increasingly, there have been some very high-profile cases of retractions of papers because they were not properly reviewed. And so I'd like to look at that a little bit, and particularly encourage everyone to really approach the review process with that understanding that this is a shared responsibility. And this is part of sort of the integrity and ethics of science and scholarly publishing. There's a couple of resources on that. One of them is on being a scientist, and it's and there's a publication by AGU as well as an ethics guide by AGU. And for those of you at universities like my own, I know that we now require a scientific ethics class of all of our graduate students to make sure that we have high quality ethical standards in submissions as well as in the reviews process itself. So this presentation is going to be a mix, in a sense, of talking about what goes into really high quality reviews, and this is from the editor's standpoint, as well as the author's standpoint. I've published scads of papers, And I've had some very, very high quality reviews that have significantly enhanced my science. And I really depend on those. Even those that seem critical at first, they're usually quite impactful. And I'm saying this as someone who has just done a revision based on such very courteous but extremely thorough reviews. So I know whereof I speak. There's another guide at University of Chicago Press that discusses what editors really want, both in submissions as well as in the review process. And I think that's really important to kind of have a good idea of the overall picture. Nathaniel, I think why don't we cue in the second poll?
All right, so the second poll that we have is, what is the most important reason for peer review? So select the one that you think best amplifies it. Allows editors to publish the highest quality of research, helps authors to improve upon their research, or provides reviewers a means to critique emerging research. So go ahead and give us your responses, and I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and it looks like it's pretty even between allowing editors to publish high-quality research and also helping authors to improve upon their research. But there are a few out there, 5%, who feel that they appreciate the ability that it allows reviewers as far as critiquing emerging research.
All right, thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you to those who responded. And I think that captures, very well the general sense of the review process and your role as reviewers. This is, for those who are very experienced, this might be a little bit of a refresher review, but the peer review workflow goes in a very systematic manner in journals, and that is that upon submission of a paper, it goes through a check by editorial staff. It's a plagiarism review check, and this detects and alerts the editor to the degree of which a journal or a paper might have included plagiarism. To tell you the truth, this also often detects what's called self-plagiarism, which is simply you're using words and figures from previous work. And again, this can be a little bit problematic, although we all have been in the position of writing a methods section of using the same method yet once again. However, that is something that it shows up by the time this hits me and all editors as an editor. And when it arrives on our desk, we're thinking about two things mainly. Does this fit within the purview of our journal? Or in other words, is it aligned with what we publish? This is why it's really important for authors to have a pretty good understanding of what a journal typically publishes before submitting. And the second issue that we address is this a high quality submission? I mean, granted, we're not sitting there reviewing the entire paper at that point, line by line, but nevertheless, we assess it initially at a kind of a 30,000-foot level for the quality of the submission. So those two evaluations, is it aligned with the scope of the journal, and is it a high-quality publication, will help us move on to the next stage, which is either select a set of expert external reviewers or simply to reject the paper. After we receive reviews, and we're going to talk much more about the reviewer's role in a little bit, but after we receive the reviews, we typically receive anywhere from 2 to 3 reviews on a given paper. We evaluate the reviews and take into account the recommendations of the subject area experts. And at that stage, we have a couple options. Invariably, papers always go through some kind of revision process. They don't simply come in and get a complete rubber stamp and move on. The degree of how much work is put into a paper depends very much on the reviewer's response then. And if I get a reviewer response saying this is extensive revisions, and another one that says major revisions, and a third one that says I think this should be rejected for scientific reasons, at that stage it very likely will be rejected. And so that's why the reviewer comments are just so important. On the other hand, of course, sometimes the papers are outstanding to start with as verified by the reviewers, in which case they simply go through what's called a minor revision, followed by an evaluation by the editor to make sure that, that the revision was really adherent to the reviews, and then on to acceptance. So you can see that there's a couple different pathways through this system. Hopefully they all lead either to acceptance or rejection. And as indicated by a first poll, we have been through a number of those. I've seen every single iteration of decision process on this workflow diagram myself. So the purpose of the peer review really is, if you get down to the bottom of it, one of the main purposes is to help us select the best possible paper to advance science within the scope of our particular journal. But what I look for a lot in the reviews is ways that I can make a paper have more of an impact. So sometimes reviewers provide fantastic guidance on that. How can you better frame this paper so it's read not by 5 sub-experts in the field, within the next 2 years, but read by 50 or by 500. That's what we're looking for. And so that's what I'm looking for also in the peer review process is that bigger picture sometimes from my reviewers. I want to get that sense. Frankly, some manuscripts can't be changed enough through the review process, or the authors themselves are not particularly responsive, at which point they invariably get rejected. So as a role of a reviewer, you're of course asked to provide that overall evaluation and comments. You were chosen as a reviewer because you're an expert in the field. Sometimes you're actually recommended by the authors upon submission. As you probably are well aware, authors of papers, they can identify anywhere from 3 to 5 potential reviewers for a paper. And as an editor-in-chief, I take those very seriously. I always get at least one person from outside that list of 3 to 5, usually based on either my own knowledge of the field or the references included in the paper itself. But these, I depend on these reviewers to provide a number of things. One of them is that they provide open comments to the author, of course, which the author can see. They also occasionally provide some confidential comments to the editor, which helps me understand the tone or role of their review. The reviewers, of course, have a responsibility to keep the manuscript confidential, and that's an absolute responsibility because that is the trust that goes in and the ethics that go into the scientific review process. And of course, they need to be professional and comment on the science and the way it's communicated. I also expect reviewers to decline to review a manuscript if it's too close to the work they're doing, or if it has other conflicts of interest. For example, I've had many cases of papers of close colleagues that I'm actively writing a paper with that I'm asked to review another paper by them. It's not the same papers I'm writing with them, of course, and I always turn those down. I feel like I probably can't give, even if I could give an unbiased review of that paper, it certainly wouldn't appear unbiased given my authorship role with that author. So this is something you as a reviewer should consider pretty carefully. Of course, there's the obvious issues with your role as a reviewer. You want to know what you're supposed to be doing as a reviewer, and we expect as an editor that you take the review very seriously. And on the right-hand side is probably the most critical pieces, is for those who've had papers rejected, or even if you haven't, if you've had many reviews, there are some review comments that are completely unhelpful for the author. remember, you're trying to give an evaluation for the editor, and you're also supporting the author in advancing the best science possible. And like it's mentioned here, writing about this makes no sense does not help the editor understand in what way it doesn't make sense, or the author in changing it. And it's really important to actually, if you're going to make comments, substantiate them in a way that the author or an editor can respond. In fact, if the comments are so critical that the author cannot respond satisfactorily, well, then that's an answer in and of itself, right, in the review process. So this is a long list. You can certainly read it yourselves, so I'm not going to go through all the details. I do want to highlight a couple of what I consider, one is an obvious and one maybe less obvious issue for you to think about as reviewers. One of them is that when you provide those general review comments, those specific review comments that you expect to have change in a manuscript, and the editor expects to see change in a manuscript, you really need to be specific about what section that comment is referring to in providing page lines and page numbers. If you, on one end of the spectrum, if you really recommend that a paper be rejected for various scientific reasons, you probably aren't going to be going through every page and every line number if it's clearly not a good paper on many fronts. But if you are asking for major or minor revisions, you really need to make it clear where those revisions take place, because then the author has a duty to respond to each and every one of those comments, specific comments. And it helps you take this from the generalized assessment to actually providing very useful constructive feedback on a manuscript. The typical questions to consider are below, but an odd thing that you might not think about, but this is what editors think about quite a bit, is should this manuscript be highlighted, and if so, why? So we depend largely on the reviewers to tell us that, hey, this paper is either run-of-the-mill, perfectly fine for the journal, but is probably not going to yield a lot of media or press coverage, or maybe not be able to be very immediately impactful for society. But we also want to know that, hey, this is a really exciting paper that should be highlighted and should be translated via, whether it's a press release or something, translated to the public. Journals, I think, have an increasing responsibility to do this, make it very clear why science is relevant to society. And this is one of the ways that you as a reviewer can do it. That provides me as an editor with a flag saying, oh, okay, if we end up publishing this paper, I need to make sure to get, for example, the media office at AGU to get involved with seeing how and where we might be able to highlight the submission. Or even encourage the faculty member themselves, as a faculty member, or the researcher to have their own institution promote this. And this I can't highlight more, because we have, quite frankly, when I look through the manuscripts that I've handled as editor, I see very little of this going on. So I don't see a lot of manuscripts being highlighted. I think that's largely because the reviewers, it's sort of on the last of the review list, and they're thinking about other things, and they don't always remember that, hey, I really should highlight that. Reviewing, you might sometimes think it's a thankless task, and it is not. It is a task, though. But there are a few organizations, including AGU, who do an excellent job of recognizing reviews formally, and they do this largely through the voice of the authors themselves, who they sometimes get review comments and say, hey, reviewer one those helped me transform my manuscript so much. And or the editor themselves recognizes how critical the reviewer's role has been. And they're highlighted annually in EOS, I know. And it's really important, I think, to give high quality reviews, not obviously for the recognition, but yet there's at least a little bit of recognition that can come along with that. I've also been a department chair for a number of years at my university. And the first thing I tell junior faculty is they should be emailing or hunting down editors at meetings or at other venues and asking to be reviewers. They should be asking largely because two reasons. One of them is that we desperately need them. Actually, three reasons. Sorry. One is we desperately need them to make science move forward. The second reason is particularly young faculty members, the more papers that they see and review, the better writers they'll be, because you start getting a perspective on how to write an effective paper. And I give the same advice to faculty for reviewing proposals as well. And the third reason is that by reviewing papers in your field, you can really keep up to date. And you can, it helps you as a reviewer actually dive in deep to papers that you might not have the time to do otherwise, but at least those that you review, you know extremely well. And it also gets you known to editors. And this is particularly true of people who are, whether they're junior or not junior faculty, where they're looking for other positions perhaps, or they're looking to move up in their career. Editors can be if editors know you, they can actually be a reasonably good job resource for you, especially if they respect your work as reviewers, because then they have a pretty good handle on your work as scientists. So there's a lot of reasons to become a reviewer. And as I mentioned, reviewing also helps your writing, and I've learned this quite a bit. You can see a number of things. First, you know how to construct a paper in a way that that reviewers can find it easiest to read and understand. But you also then start understanding what aspects of the paper that you might write might be particularly problematic and might indeed get a paper the fast road to rejection, which you don't want. They typically have you help you do two other things, and one thing is highlighted right here. Two things. One is that particularly with scientific papers that are data-based, you need excellent figures, because as any of us know who are teachers also, figures get taken from papers constantly and used in other papers or used in the classroom with proper attribution, of course. But these figures become often the way that science is communicated. So an excellent figure can be rehashed and rehashed a million times, and that's really what highlights and gains true impact for a paper. And so you really you start recognizing how to make impactful figures. I'm not saying every one of your figures are going to have to be important, but you start getting an understanding of how, for example, how important figures are for relaying science. The second area that I think that you gain appreciation for is how important abstracts are. Abstracts are not just simply taking the first line of every paragraph in your paper and copy and pasting it. Abstracts are truly a rewriting and an abstraction of the most important aspects of your work. And I say this because if I'm in a hurry professionally, I read abstracts. If it has no interest to me, or if I didn't get it, I usually won't read the paper, to be honest. So it helps you understand how important it is to write an excellent abstract. Now, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit that blends the reviewer comments with the author comments as we begin wrapping up this webinar and begin to begin opening this up to questions. The editorial decisions are several-fold. Of course, we synthesize reviews, we make recommendations, and the editors make the final decisions. As a frame of reference for those authors who've had many papers go through rounds of reviews, we try not to have a paper go through multiple rounds of reviews. Nevertheless, most manuscripts are not accepted for submissions. And I think the most important thing is embedded in this bottom question or point, and it comes up again, is if you have questions as a reviewer, or questions as an author after seeing reviews, of course, contact AGU staff or the editor themselves. I have had questions as a reviewer that I didn't want to wait to submit a thorough official review before I found out. For example, I've had issues in the past with clear cases of plagiarism, and so I wanted to contact the editor straight up before I even engaged in the review to make sure that that they were aware, or at least to make sure to explain to me what was going on in that case. And as an author, of course, number one line, it's really hard to not take things personally in the review process, because this is our sweat and blood that's out there that we're exposing to the world. And it's hard not to take things personally, but like I said, I've had, even now as a more senior researcher, I've had some of very courteous but extremely critical reviews of my work. And I know that they're not talking about me as a person. They're talking about the way that I communicated that particular research. And so, and you have to respect that. Of course, you can sit there and discount, say, oh, that's a bad review, or, you know, they're not fair. They didn't understand me, what I wrote. Well, they didn't understand you, what you wrote, largely probably because you didn't write it very clearly. And that is, I think, as an author, the biggest message that reviewers can give you is if these people who spend a lot of time looking at your manuscript didn't understand what you write, think what happens when someone just casually picks up a journal and can't understand. They're not going to read it through to the end. The most important 2 points, I think, is that you really have to take your reviewers seriously. They're not out. Yes, you know, it might seem that some tend to be negative, but they're not out to ruin your life. They're out to help you usually. And if a reviewer misunderstood a comment that you made, don't assume that they're stupid. The first assumption is that you didn't explain it very well. Of course, it's easy to make that they're stupid your first thought in your brain, but quickly squelch that and go straight to, well, I clearly did not explain this very well. Now, in terms of the receiving end of reviews, you should remember that reviews are meant to be a critique of where the conclusions maybe fall short or where you might need further support. If you are not sure what is expected of you, either as a reviewer or in this case as an author, ask the editor to clarify it. And I have done this. I've asked an editor to, that after receiving a review, I didn't quite understand either the tone or what they were asking. And rather than, you can't have communication back to the reviewer themselves, of course, just ask the editor, could you please clarify for me? That saves you time too, and you're not misunderstanding and getting all mad about something that maybe is not all that important. The next item is, I think, really important. Sometimes reviews some people are very busy, so their tone doesn't seem extremely respectful because largely they're simply trying to get points across quickly and they're moving on to the next review they're having to do. So, but in your response, of course, you should be respectful because that reviewer is likely going to see it again, or in some cases they might be reviewers that you might have even recommended. And understand also, of course, that with the internationalization of science, we have a lot of submissions that you are reviewing for that are not from native English speakers. And so although you can comment on that and request that the authors in the next revision get editorial assistance with English language, it's important to be respectful of that. I would hate to see a paper I would write in my very cursory Spanish, for example. So I would also consider, I hope for the same respect from you as a reviewer. If the paper is rejected, which might be from the result of your review, it might be just from the editor's action or whatever, as you know, and many of you have had, that's not uncommon. In most cases, you cannot resubmit it to the same journal unless it's specifically requested. I will sometimes reject a paper, even if it's had major revisions on the reviews. because I'm not exactly sure that they can respond to those major revisions adequately. And by rejecting a paper, if I suggest that, I will actually suggest point blank, I would like to see this paper again if the authors were comfortable, if these points were addressed. By releasing the paper, by rejecting it, it allows authors to pursue publishing that in another journal if they want to, or simply resubmitting it again. But you can't just simply resubmit after a paper's been rejected and hope it'll be reviewed again. Occasionally I have papers that I have to reject even after revision, but I still think that there's a home for them in another journal, and AGU has a capability among us editors to move papers, recommend that they be transferred to another journal, another AGU journal. And that's a check box that we have, and I believe the authors have as well. So as reviewers, our main job is to help you and your science as in our role, and we aim to optimize our journals and our science, and that means decisions that we make have to have that balance, as I mentioned right at the beginning, between the scope of the journal and the quality of submission. We are also always trying to aim for the highest standards. That's why I have sent papers back that might be really intriguing, but they simply are not of quality that I would like to see in my journal, or I think more importantly, they're not of a quality that I would like to burden my reviewers with. As a frame of reference for people who are potential reviewers out there who have reviewed before, my personal experience is I have to request something like 8 to 10 different people to review a manuscript before I get an adequate number of reviewers accept. It's really important that you do your utmost to review as much as possible, I take into account the fact that I don't want you to accept a review request out of obligation when you clearly don't have time to do a thorough review. I understand we're busy and you have your own control over your own time as a reviewer, but if I personally accept a review responsibility, I know that I've accepted that, so that shows up in my calendar, and I get it done by the time it's supposed to be due. Granted, I rarely get it done, weeks in advance, but I do get it done by the time it's supposed to be due. Again, this is AGU actually runs 20 journals, including a number of their gold open access, publish quite a few papers per year. And we have a very long reputation for quality and impact, and a big commitment to trying to make science as open as possible. And as I mentioned, I would also always like to promote, put a plug in for GeoHealth, which is a new journal in the stable of journals of AGU. One is publishing really exciting work. Saw a press release from one of the papers that we recommended be highlighted that just came out this morning. So it's great stuff. We also tend to have not only high impact, because remember we're a society of 62,000 people, so we have a huge community. But we have with what's called the GEM system, we have a pretty seamless submission and review interface through Wiley publications. There's a number, as you well know, you could be asked to review a number of different manuscript types, ranging from a standard, what we call research article, to a review or synthesis, to sometimes some journals have these technical report methods and data. Finally, I try to promote this a lot in GeoHealth, more of an open dialogue on science, so they have commentaries and editorials and comment replies. You really have to contact the editors first before you pursue something like that. And AGU works very hard to promote our science, your science. So as you can see, there's a link that you can look through there about that promotion, and that's in the terms of excellent covers. Here's our August cover of GeoHealth, press releases, blogs, and so forth. And I think one exciting thing that I've seen lately is that bottom link, Editors Vox. So it's a way for editors to communicate to the community, a larger community, about either their journal, trends in their journal, or science a little bit more broadly. So with that, I would like to thank you for having attended to this and listened, and I am happy to answer any and all questions or comments that you might have.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. It's a wonderful presentation you've just given. I have a couple of questions already, and for those of you who are still with us, feel free to drop them in the question box, and we're going to get to as many as we can. The first one that I have, you briefly touched upon it. GeoHealth is relatively new to AGU, and could you tell us a little bit more about it?
I'd be happy to. GeoHealth fills a gap that AGU recognized as a society several years ago, this gap between our understanding of Earth processes and how they impact human health and human sustainability and ecosystem health. So we have a lot of technical papers. We have, there's biogeochemical cycles, there's all kinds of technical journals that publish in narrower fields. GeoHealth is intended to cast a broader net and inform the community about the intersection between environmental processes and society, in a sense. So, for example, two fascinating papers come to mind of late. One of them was a commentary that we just published and that press release was on this morning, was about really considering the impact of intensive livestock operations and practices in populated areas. We know very little about, for example, the transmission of disease from livestock to humans. We know a little bit. Avian flu gives us some indicators of that. But there's a number of other zoonotic potential impactors for that, and there's contaminants that might cross-transport in viruses. Another one was a fascinating paper last month where they took researchers took a ice core that dated back 2,000 years and tracked the record of atmospheric lead deposition, showing that actually our background lead has always been high from mining activities dating all the way back to the Romans, and this was from an alpine glacier setting. The only time it hasn't been high has been during the time of the Great Plague that decimated over 30% of Europe and shuttered mines throughout Europe. So those are just two of many examples of that intersection between environmental processes and humans and society.
All right, great. So I've got a couple of more questions here. As an editor, how do you give feedback to reviewers when their review is not helpful, not structured the way you'd like to see, or inappropriate?
That is an outstanding question, and I will tell you that fortunately that has not come up a whole lot in my experience. But let me tell you, sometimes I do basically I act as a review whisperer back to the authors. Sometimes when a reviewer was not very clear in their review comments, I actually try to act as an intermediary, so the reviewer does not have to be bothered by any of that. And so I will, if it's clear that the reviewer maybe didn't do a very thorough job in the review, whereas another reviewer did, I will ask the author to mainly prioritize the review comments of one particular reviewer over another. That's a prerogative of, of our position, because we're seeing multiple reviews for a paper. I have not had the direct experience that is an excellent question on the second point of how you have the reviewer teach the reviewer how to maybe do a better job on the review process. And I think that's an intriguing question. I don't have an answer for that. I'm sorry.
No problem. What you got there was good enough to begin with as a start. So I've got a couple more here. So if an editor decides to reject a paper, and like that, the revisions that would be required were too much, and it's just an all-out rejection, does the author receive a version of the reviewer's comments?
Yes, they do. That's a nice thing about this scientific process, is that authors, even with I hate to say thoroughly rejected paper, but I get the idea. the authors have a right to see every review comment that is reasonable. So I've never edited a review comment in my life. The authors see all of it. Sometimes, like I said, I try to translate those comments in a way that maybe will cause less hurt feelings with the author. But no, they see the review comments, which is, I think, so important, right? Because that helps them understand the decision and then revise and make a better paper out of it. The only part of the communication they don't see is the confidential comments to the editor. But I'll tell you, from being an editor I'm also an editor for another journal, those aren't usually very extensive. Usually most reviewers put all of their cogent and important remarks right there openly to the author.
Great. So next one, you touched a little bit upon this. As an early career scientist, how do I get involved as a reviewer?
First of all, definitely do get involved as a reviewer, both of manuscripts and proposals as much as possible. Now, if you're an early career scientist, it's not like editors or even other maybe scientists necessarily know your name very well. So here's 2 tips I would give you. One tip: every early career scientist has had a mentor, right? Whether that's their PhD advisor or postdoc advisor or some other research mentor, someone on their committee. Let them know, let your mentors know that you'd be willing to review papers that they get review requests for. Let me clarify what I mean by that. When I send out a request for review of people who I know are pretty high profile folks and who are probably crazy busy on 5 million things, I'll tend to write in the review request that this comment, which is that if there's somebody else capable and experienced in their research team or among their research network, please recommend that name to me to reach out to ask to review. So that's one way to do it, is through your mentor network. The second way is something that I mentioned, is that drop the editor an email. Say, and I would even expand this a little bit for junior faculty. I say drop them an email and say, hey, I'm new to this. Here's in 4 sentences, here's what I do research on. Please consider me for reviewing potential in the future. The second is, if you're a not so junior person, so someone kind of heading up to the, let's say I'm only thinking of the US equivalent, the assistant to the associate professor step, for example, I would suggest that you do the same thing, but I request the editors consider you for an associate editor position, because that gets you a more substantial role in scientific publication and gets you a higher profile in that case.
Okay, so got another one here, and some of these are pretty long, so I'm trying to craft them a little bit here. There's a question about if a paper would require a lot of work to meet publication standards, is it reasonable to only provide broad comments instead of possibly wasting the time of the author by presenting them with a long list of smaller errors or problems?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes, and I touched on that briefly during the presentation. Well, let me say it's an equivocal yes. If it is clear that the paper should be rejected, I think it's definitely your right and responsibility as a reviewer to make it clear to the editor why that is, and that usually then wouldn't be enumerated down to, for example, on line 554 they had comma instead of colon. However, if you suggest major revision, that usually means that there's some promise in here. So if there's this promise in here, that is a time where you try to give them as much feedback as possible. Now, I sometimes restrict that as a reviewer myself to the higher level issues. And I've actually just received reviews on one of my papers that was of that order, higher level issues. And so this person did not go line by line. And that actually was also very helpful for me as an author. And it's also helpful for editors. There are some cases, though, where you think it's major revisions, but it's, this is a high quality paper. Then you might as well, if you've done the effort to go through it line by line, you might as well relay that to the author so they can improve it straight out. Because it might be that you recommend major revisions. They come in and they did them, and the editor says, you know what? The other reviewer said minor revisions. This one person said major. They seem to have satisfied everything. We're going to publish it. In which case, you never got a chance to give those detailed comments that you might find will further improve the paper.
Great. So I've got a few more. The person would like to know, I think that they're trying to get at the anonymity of peer review and authorship, and whether or not the author should be concerned that the reviewer was being anonymous. Not entirely sure.
Well, let me rephrase it in the way I think I heard that, which is that part of the review instructions for you as reviewers is to make it clear whether you want your review to be anonymous or not. Typically, what that means is typically all reviews are anonymous unless you flat out state it to the editor saying, no, I want to have my name associated with this review, and sometimes that's achieved by putting your name actually in the review. And in those cases, when I as an editor get that, I will actually go back to the reviewer and say, your name was in the review. Are you sure that that's what you wanted to have happen? And 100% of the time they said, yes, that's why I put it there. And so, and in some, it depends. Some journals, they ask with a check mark to toggle box, like, yes, I want to be, my name to be disclosed to the authors or not. I'm usually a fan of full disclosure of reviewers if the reviewer themselves wants to be disclosed, and a couple of journals require it because, of course, they have an open review process. Not GeoHealth, there are other of these AGU journals, but some do. The reason I think it's important to make that decision, have the reviewer make that decision is, frankly, the best reviews are ones that you don't want to hide behind anonymity for anyway, unless you're in a vulnerable junior faculty position. You want to make it clear, hey, this is me, this is why I said it, and that's my stance on this. And that helps the editor understand where you're coming from as well.
Great. All right, so I have one last one. So you touched upon this issue already, the issue of having a negative or dismissive tone in your review and the impact that could have on authors. The particular question that this person has, they're concerned with that impact to their confidence, to authors' confidence in general when they get a bad review, especially to those that are either early career and or from a developing country. And they'd like to know, in your opinion, what can authors, reviewers, and editors do to improve this situation?
It's an excellent question. It can be devastating to get bad reviews. But first, I want to make a distinction between a negative review and a bad review, right? A negative review is one that has looked carefully at the science presented and has come to the evaluation or assessment that for reasons X, Y, or Z, there are faults in the science or faults in the way it's written or faults in the conclusion. Those negative reviews can actually be extremely positive in the revision process because it gives you very direct ways to improve your work. As opposed to a bad review, I consider a bad review one where the reviewer didn't spend enough time or is, as you indicated, dismissive, rude, occasionally has what we call an axe to grind against somebody's advisor or something that you have no part of whatsoever, and that's rough. And as an editor, like I say, I've come across reviews with a kind of a negative tone, not negative as in helpful, but a little bit unhelpful, but it's not really my role to be editing out comments that the reviewer is providing back to the author. And it goes back to this thing of, maybe there should be a little bit better dialogue from the editor back to the reviewer about some of these comments. And I'm going to take that to heart. It's a little bit hard because as an editor, you're asking reviewers to take a tremendous amount of time in a review, and then you're turning back and criticizing them, which can be kind of rough. But I think the more that people listen to webinars like this or take into heart the importance of how you write a review, the less that happens. And I understand that junior faculty, faculty from maybe from universities that don't have a long tradition of publications, perhaps from the developing world, or certainly ones that are more regional in scope, a negative review can actually a bad review can absolutely destroy a person's career. And so I think you as a reviewer, me as an editor, me as an author have to really consider that when either doing the review or editing a manuscript.
Thanks, Gabe. That was an excellent answer. With that, that actually concludes all of our questions. So I want to thank you again for presenting this afternoon, and I want to thank everyone who joined in with us this afternoon. If you are interested in more on this topic and webinars like it, we have a few more coming up in the next 2 weeks. October 5th, we have one about manuscript submission, and then on October 12th, something that you were actually talking about, Gabe, the importance of figures in your publications. We're actually having a webinar on creating those figures. So that'll be October 12th, and both those are at 2 p.m. Yeah, so we'd love for you guys to join us. Yeah, once again, thank you, Gabe.
Oh, thank you, Nathaniel. It sounds like I've got to book my date for October 12th because I want to take that webinar myself.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you later. Bye.